The morning Cora Vass was put off the stage in Hatchet Creek, there were 11 people on the boardwalk to see it. She had not done anything wrong. That was the part that stayed with the witnesses longer than they admitted, the part that made a few of them look away and find something to study in the middle distance while it happened. The driver had been given instructions by a man named Delbert Foss, who was Cora's employer of 14 months and who had, 3 days prior, decided he no longer required her services as his household's cook and housekeeper, and who had further decided, in the particular way of men who have done something they know is shabby, that the best response to his own conduct was to make hers look worse. He had sent word ahead to Hatchet Creek that she had stolen from his pantry. He had not sent proof because there was none, but he had sent the word, and the word had arrived before she did, the way such words do in small places, low and fast, and ahead of themselves. The driver set her trunk on the boardwalk planks with more force than the task required. Cora did not flinch at the sound. She stood with her chin level in the way of a woman who has decided in advance not to fall apart, her coat buttoned to the throat against the November cold, a small brown satchel held in both hands in front of her like something she was carrying to church. She was 31 years old. She had gray beginning at her left temple, a narrow thread of it, and her eyes were the color of creek water in October, neither green nor brown, but both, and steady. The 11 people on the boardwalk did not speak to her. One woman, a Mrs. Aldine Pruitt, who ran the dry goods with her husband and who had a voice built for distance, said something to the woman beside her that was not quite quiet enough. The word she used was trouble. She said it the way people say it when they mean to be heard saying it, with a little weight on the front end, a little satisfaction on the back. Cora heard it. She did not look at Mrs. Pruitt. She set her satchel on top of her trunk and looked down the length of the main street of Hatchet Creek, which she had never seen before in her life, and took stock of it, the way a person does when they are trying to determine whether a place is survivable. What she could see: a livery at the far end, a church with a listing steeple, a mill still running by the sound of it, a smithy with its doors open, and a column of iron-gray smoke going straight up in the cold air, a general store, a land office, a building with no sign that might have been anything, mud in the street, frozen at the edges, 3 horses at the rail outside what she took for a saloon, a dog sleeping against a barrel. She had arrived in a town that did not want her with $4.70, a trunk of clothes and kitchen tools, a recipe box that had belonged to her mother, and no plan. By the second autumn, people would stop calling the farm at the edge of town the lonely place. She didn't know that yet. She picked up her satchel and stood beside her trunk and waited, because there was nothing else to do, and because she had learned, in the way that people learn things they wish they hadn't needed to, that waiting with composure was its own kind of statement. It was then that she became aware of the man standing at the open doors of the smithy across the street. He was not watching her the way the boardwalk crowd was watching her. He was watching her the way a person watches something they are trying to understand the full nature of before they act. He was large in the way of men who work iron, broad through the chest and shoulders, with hands that looked as though they had been built for a different scale of work than most hands were. His hair was dark and needed cutting. He had a leather apron on over a heavy shirt, and he was holding a rag that he was not using. He might have been 35. He might have been older. He had a face that had been weathered past the point where age was easy to read, and his eyes, even at that distance, were attentive in a way that was different from the attention of the boardwalk crowd. There was no appetite in it, no judgment that she could see, just looking. His name was Meg Calloway. He had run the smithy in Hatchet Creek for 9 years. He had a farm 2 miles out on the creek road that he worked in, the hours around the smithy work, which meant he worked from before light until after dark most days, and had been doing so long enough that he had stopped noticing it. He had a daughter of 7 named Bess, and a son of 11 named Ward, and a woman named Mrs. Holt who came 3 days a week to cook and mind them, and who had told him the previous Friday that her sister in Caldwell was ill, and she would not be back until spring, if then. He crossed the street. He did not hurry. He walked the way he did most things, with a steadiness that was not slowness. And he stopped at a distance that was respectful, and looked at her trunk, and then at her. She looked back at him. He said, "I have a smithy and a farm and 2 children, and no one to cook or keep the house until spring. The work is hard and the house is plain. There's a warm room and no questions about whatever brought you here." She looked at him for a moment. The boardwalk had gone quiet in the way of a place that is listening very hard while pretending not to. She said, "Can you tell me the nature of the work?" He said, "Cooking for 3, sometimes 4 when the hands are in. Keeping the house. The children need minding after school. The farm has a kitchen garden that wants attention come spring. I pay fair, and there's a room off the kitchen that locks from the inside." She said, "I can do all of that. I'm not afraid of hard work." He said, "I didn't think you were." He looked at her trunk. "I have a wagon around back." "All right," she said. That was the whole of it. He picked up her trunk as though it weighed nothing, and she followed him around the side of the smithy, to where a brown horse stood hitched to a flat wagon, and neither of them said anything else until they were out of town and the road had opened up into the brown fields and the cold sky. He said, "I'm Meg Calloway." She said, "Cora Vass." He nodded once and kept his eyes on the road, and she kept hers on the fields. And the town of Hatchet Creek fell away behind them, and Mrs. Pruitt watched them go from the window of the dry goods and stored it up for later. The farm was 2 miles out, as he had said, set back from the creek road behind a windbreak of cottonwoods that had lost their leaves. The house was plain, as he had said. Board and batten, 2 stories, a covered porch that needed one of its boards replaced, a kitchen addition on the back that was newer than the main house, a barn, a smokehouse, a woodpile that was serious and well organized. The yard was not tidy, but it was not neglected either. It was the yard of a man who had too much to do and was doing his best with the time he had. The children were in school. They came home at 3:30, and Cora had been in the kitchen long enough by then to have found where everything was kept, to have started a pot of beans with the salt pork she'd found in the larder, and to have identified the 3 things that needed fixing most urgently in that kitchen, which were a hinge on the larder door, a gap in the window casing that was letting in cold air, and a pot hook that had been bent and rehung at the wrong angle so that whatever was on it would always hang crooked. Ward came in first. He was 11 and looked like his father around the jaw and eyes, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her with a particular stillness that was also his father's. He said, "Who are you?" She said, "Cora Vass. I'm here to cook and keep the house while Mrs. Holt is away." He said, "Mrs. Holt doesn't move things around." She said, "I haven't moved anything yet. I've only been looking." He considered this. He sat down at the table and opened his school book and said nothing else. Bess came in behind him at a run and stopped when she saw Cora, and then looked at the pot on the stove, and then looked back at Cora. She said, "Are those beans?" Cora said, "They are." Bess said, "Ward burned the beans last time he made them. It was very bad." Ward said, "I was 10. Bess climbed up onto the bench beside her brother and watched Cora work with the frank and total attention of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't watching. Cora did not perform for her. She just cooked, moving through the kitchen with the economy of someone who has worked in small spaces for a long time. And after a while, Bess said, "You know where everything is already." Cora said, "I looked around while you were at school." Bess said, "Papa does that too. Looks at something until he understands it." Cora said nothing to that. She stirred the beans. Wren came in from the smithy at dusk, washed at the pump, and sat at the head of the table without ceremony. Cora set the beans and cornbread on the table and poured the coffee and sat at the far end. They ate. The food was good and everyone at the table knew it, and no one said so, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. After supper, Wren said, "The room's through there. The lock works." She said, "Thank you." He said, "Breakfast is at 6. He said it as information, not instruction. She said, "I'll have it ready." He nodded and took his coffee to the front room, and she washed the dishes and listened to the wind come down off the ridge. And the house settled around her the way houses do, finding its sounds for the night. The first week was work. There was a great deal of it, and Cora moved through it without complaint and without asking for instruction she didn't need. She cooked 3 meals a day and kept the kitchen and swept the floors and mended the gap in the window, casing herself with a strip of cloth and some tallow she found in the smokehouse, which was not a permanent fix but would hold the cold out until someone with the right materials could do it properly. She found the children's winter clothes in a trunk upstairs and aired them and checked the seams and let out the hem on Bess's wool dress 2 inches without being asked, because it was plain the dress had been let down once already and needed it again. Ward watched her. He was not hostile exactly. He was careful. He was a child who had decided at some point that the way to manage a world that changed without warning was to withhold trust until it was clearly warranted, and Cora did not try to charm it out of him. She simply worked, and she was consistent. And on the 4th morning she put a plate of fried eggs and toast in front of him, and he looked at it, and then at her and said, "You cut the bread thick." She said, "I do." He said, "Mrs. Holt cuts it thin." She said, "I can cut it thinner if you prefer." He thought about it. He said, "No, thick is fine." That was the whole of it, but it was something. Bess required no such process. By the 3rd day she had established a habit of sitting on the kitchen table, which was not where children were supposed to sit, and talking to Cora while she worked. Cora did not tell her to get down. She listened, and asked questions when Bess paused, and learned more about the farm and the town and the Calloway family in 3 days of kitchen conversation with a 7-year-old than she would have learned from a month of adult discourse. She learned that the farm had been called the Lonely Place by some people in town since Wren's wife, Eleanor, had died of fever 4 years prior. She learned that Ward had been the one to find her. She learned that Wren had not gone into town for anything except supplies since the funeral, and that he sometimes stood at the fence at the edge of the north field at dusk and looked at nothing for a while before coming in. She learned that Bess thought the smithy smelled like thunder, and that Ward had once read every book in the Hatchet Creek lending library, and then started over. She learned that the dog, whose name was Peck, was not allowed in the house, but sometimes came in anyway, and slept under the kitchen table, and Wren pretended not to notice. Cora received all of this without comment. She stirred and chopped and kneaded and listened. And when Bess was done talking, she said, "I think I'll make a pie this afternoon, if there are apples in the cellar." Bess said, "There are. Papa put up 6 bushels. Then we'll have pie," Cora said. By the end of the first week, the hinge on the larder door had been fixed, though Cora had not fixed it. She had noticed it was fixed on a Thursday morning when she went to get the flour, and she stood there a moment looking at it. The hinge was tight and clean, and the door swung without sound. She said nothing about it. Wren said nothing about it either, and the absence of comment from both of them was its own kind of language, though neither of them named it yet. The second week brought the first snow, 1.5 inches that came down overnight and left the farm quiet and white in the morning, and Cora was up before 5 to get the stove going and the coffee on. And when Wren came down at 5:30, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the lit stove and the coffee and the window with the gray-white snow light coming through it, and something moved across his face that he set aside before it could be read. He said, "You're up early." She said, "The cold woke me. Coffee's ready." He poured a cup and stood at the window, looking out at the snow for a moment, and she started the biscuits. And neither of them said anything else, and the quiet between them was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of two people who have been in the same space long enough to have stopped startling each other. Ward came down and looked out the window at the snow and said, "School will be open." Cora said, "I'll pack you something warm for noon." He looked at her. He said, "Mrs. Holt forgets." She said, "I won't forget." He looked at her a moment longer and then sat down at the table, and she put a biscuit in front of him, and he ate it without further comment. But he ate it carefully. The way you eat something you don't want to admit is exactly right. The pot hook was straightened and rehung at the correct angle sometime in the second week. Cora noticed it on a Wednesday when she went to hang the stew pot and found it hung straight for the first time. She hung the pot. She started the stew. She did not say anything about the hook. Nothing was said about the hook. She said nothing about it either. The weeks moved in this way, accumulating small repairs and small consistencies, and the farm began to feel less like a place she was working in, and more like a place she was part of, which was a feeling she did not examine too closely, because she had learned that examined feelings have a way of becoming demands, and she was not in a position to make demands of anything. Meg Calloway was not a man who spoke much, but he was a man who noticed, and what he noticed about Cora Vass in those first weeks was this. She did not waste motion. She did not waste words. She did not perform contentment or perform suffering. She simply did the work that was in front of her, and she did it well, and she was kind to his children in a way that was not sentimental, which was the only kind of kindness they would have accepted. She was kind the way you are kind when you mean it, and don't need credit for it, which is the hardest kind to sustain and the only kind that lasts. He did not think about this directly. He thought about the drainage post on the east fence that needed replacing before the spring thaw, and the order of iron stock he needed to put in before the roads got bad, and whether Ward's boots would last the winter. But sometimes in the evenings, when he was sitting with his coffee in the front room, and he could hear Cora moving in the kitchen, putting things away with that quiet economy of hers, he would sit very still and listen to the sounds of the house being inhabited. And there was something in it that he had not felt in 4 years, which was the sense that the house was not just sheltering people, but actually containing a life. He did not say this to anyone. He went to bed and got up before light and went to the smithy and worked iron, and the days moved. It was Bess who detonated it, as children do, with the blunt accuracy of someone who has not yet learned that some truths are supposed to be approached from the side. It was a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of December, after supper, when the 4 of them were in the front room, in the way they had fallen into by then, Wren with his account book, Ward with his reading, Bess with a length of yarn she was attempting to braid into something whose purpose was unclear. Cora was mending a tear in Ward's coat by the lamp, her needle moving in and out with the same steadiness as everything else she did. Bess looked up from her yarn and looked at Cora and said, "Mama used to sit there." The room went still. Ward looked up from his book. Wren's pencil stopped. Cora's needle did not stop. She took one more stitch, and then she looked at Bess with an expression that was full of care and completely composed. She said, "Is that all right?" Bess considered this with the seriousness she brought to serious things. She said, "Yes." She said it the way she said things she had thought about, with a small nod at the end. Then she went back to her yarn. Ward looked at his book. He did not read it for a moment. Then he turned a page, though Cora did not think he had finished what was on it. Wren looked at Cora. She was looking at the coat in her hands, her needle moving again. He looked at her for a moment, in the lamplight, at her hands and her face and the gray at her temple, and then he looked at his account book and did not see any of the numbers on the page. The fire settled. The wind moved in the cottonwoods outside. Cora finished the seam and broke the thread and folded the coat over the arm of the chair and reached for the next piece of mending. And the room breathed again. and nothing was said about any of it, and all of it was understood. She thought about it later in her room, lying in the dark with the quilt pulled up and the cold pressing at the window. She thought about the lamp and the mending and Bess's face. She thought about the particular weight of the moment, the way it had landed on her chest like something being set down carefully. She thought about how she had been in this house for 3 weeks, and how it had come to feel more like a home than any place she had lived since she was 9 years old, and her mother had died, and she had gone to the county home in Willa, and begun the long education in making herself useful in other people's spaces, without taking up too much room. She was taking up room here. She knew it. She was not sure what to do with that. She thought about Wren Calloway's face in the lamplight when he had looked at her, and she put that thought away in a place where it would not cause her trouble, and she went to sleep. It was a Saturday in January when Delbert Foss came to Hatchet Creek. Cora did not know he was coming. She had not thought much about him since the first week, when she had lain awake one night and gone through the arithmetic of what he had done to her. The 14 months of work, the false words sent ahead, the trunk on the boardwalk, and had arrived at the conclusion that she was angry, which she was allowed to be, and that the anger was not useful to her right now, which it wasn't, and had set it aside in the way she set things aside, thoroughly, and without pretending it wasn't there. She was in town that Saturday with Bess to get flour and salt and a length of cotton the children needed for a school project, and she was at the counter in Pruitt's Dry Goods, counting out coins, when the door opened and Delbert Foss walked in. He was a broad man going soft, with the look of someone who had been handsome once and had decided to continue behaving as though he were. He wore a good coat. He saw her immediately, and his face did the thing faces do when they are recalculating. Mrs. Pruitt behind the counter saw him see Cora, and her expression sharpened with the particular alertness of a woman who has been waiting for something interesting to happen and has just been rewarded. Foss said, "Cora." She said, "Mr. Foss?" He said, "I heard you'd landed on your feet." He said it with a smile that was meant to seem generous and was not. She said, "I have work and a place to stay." She kept her voice even and her hands still on the counter. He said, "I hope you've been honest about your situation here." He looked at Mrs. Pruitt when he said it, which was who he was really talking to. "I had to let her go for cause," he said to Mrs. Pruitt. "It was an unfortunate business." Mrs. Pruitt made a sound that was not quite a word, a sound of received information being stored. Bess, who was standing beside Cora and had been looking at a jar of penny candy, looked up at Delbert Foss with the clear eyes of a child who does not yet know she is supposed to pretend she doesn't understand what is happening. She said, "That's not true." Foss looked down at her. Bess said, "Papa says a man who sends a lie ahead of a woman to a town she's never been to is a coward, and a small one at that." She said it the way she said things she had memorized, with care for each word. The dry goods went very quiet. Mrs. Pruitt looked at Bess. Then she looked at Foss. Then she looked at Cora. Cora looked at Bess. Her face was doing what she needed it to do, which was remain composed, but something behind her eyes was warm in a way she could not entirely account for. She said to Bess, quietly, "Where did you hear your papa say that?" Bess said, "He said it to Mr. Aldine last Tuesday when Mr. Aldine came to get his wagon wheel fixed. I was in the barn." Cora picked up her parcel and took Bess's hand and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Pruitt," and walked out of the dry goods into the cold January street, and Delbert Foss stood in the dry goods with Mrs. Pruitt looking at him, and the street outside held its breath for a moment, and then went on about its business. The town watched and stored it up. What happened next happened the way things happen in small places, not in one large event, but in a series of small ones, each of which changed the angle of things slightly. Mrs. Pruitt told her husband what Bess had said. Mr. Aldine confirmed, when asked, that Wren Calloway had in fact said something to that effect, in those words or close to them, and that he had said it plainly and without apparent emotion, which was how Meg Calloway said most things. 2 women who had been in the dry goods that Saturday told 2 other women. By the end of the week, the story of Delbert Foss's visit had been compared to the story of Cora's arrival in November, and the comparison did not flatter Foss, and the town, which had been watching and waiting to see which way the wind was blowing, began quietly, without announcement, to blow in a different direction. Foss himself stayed in Hatchet Creek 3 days, which was 2 days longer than he needed to, and on the 2nd day he went to the land office and made inquiries about a parcel of creek-bottom land that Meg Calloway had been farming but had not yet formally purchased, and which Foss had apparently heard about from someone and decided was worth pursuing. He filed a competing claim with the land office on a Thursday morning. Wren heard about it Thursday afternoon. Cora heard about it Thursday evening, when Wren came in from the smithy later than usual, and sat down at the supper table and ate without speaking, which was not unusual, but with a quality of stillness that was different from his ordinary quiet, the kind of stillness that is not peace, but its opposite. After supper, when the children were upstairs, she poured him a 2nd cup of coffee and set it in front of him and sat down across the table. She said, "Is it the creek parcel?" He looked at her. She said, "Bess told me Mr. Foss was at the land office. He said he filed a claim." She said, "Do you have your original filing papers?" He said, "I have them." She said, "And your proof of improvements? The drainage work, the fencing?" He looked at her steadily. He said, "How do you know about land claims?" She said, "I grew up in Willa County. My uncle lost 40 acres to a paper claim when I was 12. I learned what I could after that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have the papers. The drainage work is documented. The fencing is visible to anyone who walks the land." She said, "Then you need to be at the land office when it opens tomorrow morning with everything you have, and you need to bring a witness who can speak to the improvements." He said Aldine was out there last fall. She said, "Then bring Aldine." He looked at his coffee. He said, "Foss is doing this because of you." She said, "He's doing it because he's that kind of man. I'm just the occasion." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I'm sorry he came here." She said, "Don't be. He would have found another occasion eventually. At least, this one has documentation." Something moved at the corner of his mouth and returned to where it had been. He was at the land office when it opened Friday morning with Aldine and his papers, and the claim agent, a careful man named Birch, who had been in Hatchet Creek long enough to know the difference between a working farm and a paper maneuver, reviewed both filings with the thoroughness the situation required. Foss was there too, with a lawyer from the county seat who had a good coat and a briefcase, and who spoke at some length about the technicalities of the filing date. Birch listened to all of it. He looked at Wren's documentation. He looked at the dates. He asked Aldine 3 questions and received 3 direct answers. Then he looked at Foss's lawyer and said that the creek parcel had been under documented improvement for 6 years, and that the competing claim had no basis he could find, and that if the filing was not withdrawn by end of business, he would be writing to the county seat himself to ask some questions about its origin. Foss's lawyer said something else. Birch looked at him with the expression of a man who has heard a great many things in a land office and has found that most of them do not improve upon examination. The claim was withdrawn before noon. Foss left Hatchet Creek that afternoon. He did not speak to Cora before he left. He did not speak to Wren. He went to the livery, got his horse, and rode south, and the town watched him go from various windows and doorways, and did not wave. Mrs. Pruitt, at her window, watched him until he was out of sight. Then she went back to her counter and said something to her husband that was not recorded, but which her husband responded to with a nod and the expression of a man who has revised an opinion and is not entirely comfortable about the revision, but is making it anyway. It was the Saturday after Foss left that Wren Calloway came into the kitchen at noon and found Cora at the table with a bowl of bread dough, her sleeves rolled up and her hair coming loose from its pin on one side, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him. She looked up. He said, "I want to say something." She waited. He came to the table and sat down across from her, not at the head where he always sat, but across from her. And he put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. He said, "When I crossed the street in November, I told myself it was because I needed someone for the kitchen and the children." He paused. That was true. He paused again. It wasn't the whole of it. She was still. The bread dough sat between them. He said, "I've watched you these 3 months." He said it simply, without ornament. "I've watched you with the children, and with the work, and with this house. And I've watched what you did last week, what you knew to do about the papers and the claim, and what you didn't say when you could have said, 'I told you so,' and a great many other things that I don't have the right words for." He looked up at her. He said, "I'm not a man who says things well. I know that. But I want to say this plainly so there's no confusion about what I mean." He took a breath. "I'm asking you to stay, permanent, as my wife, if that's what you'd want." He said it straight and flat and without decoration, the way he said everything that mattered. "And I want you to know that if it isn't what you want, or if you need time to be sure of it, you have that time. The room is yours as long as you need it, and the work is yours as long as you want it. And I'm not asking you to decide anything today." He stopped. He had said what he meant to say. He put his hands back flat on the table and waited. She looked at him. She looked at his hands and his face and the way he was sitting, upright and still, a man who had said a difficult thing and was prepared to receive whatever answer came without making it harder for her. She thought about the hinge on the larder door and the pot hook and the porch step that had been fixed one morning in February without comment. She thought about the coffee left on the counter on the mornings she was late down. She thought about the way he had said, "My wife, if that's what you'd want," with the emphasis where it was, on her wanting, on her choosing, which was not how most men framed such things. She thought about Bess saying Mama used to sit there, and the way the room had gone still, and how she had taken one more stitch before she looked up, and how the stitch had been exactly right. She said, "Yes." He looked at her. She said, "That's what I want." He was still for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when something had been settled and could now be moved forward from. He said, "All right." She said, "All right." He got up from the table. He looked at the bread dough. He said, "I'll let you finish." She said, "It needs another 20 minutes." He said, "I'll be in the barn." He went out. She looked at the door for a moment after it closed, and then she looked at the dough, and she pressed her hands into it, and began to work it again, and the kitchen was warm, and the light was coming through the window at the angle it came through in February, low and thin and honest, and she was not performing anything at all. The children were told that evening at supper. Ward looked at his plate for a moment, and then looked at Cora and said, "Are you going to keep making the bread this way?" She said, "I am." He said, "Good," and went back to his supper. Bess said, "I knew it." She said it with the satisfaction of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. She said, "I told Peck in November." Wren said, "You told the dog." Bess said, "Peck is a good listener." The corner of Wren's mouth moved once and returned to where it had been. They were married on the first Saturday of March in the Hatchet Creek church with the listing steeple, which had been straightened the previous fall by a crew that Wren had organized, and which now stood plumb against the early spring sky. The ceremony was short and plain, as they had both wanted, and the town came, most of it, which was its own kind of statement, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. Mrs. Pruitt came. She sat in the fourth row and she did not say anything, with her voice built for distance. And her silence was as close to an apology as such people give, and Cora accepted it for what it was. Delbert Foss was not there. He was in another county by then, which was where he stayed. Spring came in, the way it comes to that country, not all at once, but in increments. A warm afternoon here, a cold snap there, the ground softening and then firming again. And then one morning you wake up and the cottonwoods are showing green, and the creek is running high, and something in the air has changed for good. Cora was in the kitchen garden on a Thursday morning in April, turning the first bed, when Bess came out with Peck at her heels and sat on the fence rail and watched. She said, "Are you going to plant beans?" Cora said, "I am, and carrots, and the kitchen herbs, and I thought we'd try a row of sweet corn along the south fence." Bess said, "Papa likes corn." Cora said, "I know he does." Bess swung her feet against the fence rail. She said, "Are you happy here?" Cora pressed the spade into the earth and turned a long, dark ribbon of soil and looked at it for a moment. She said, "Yes." She said it the way she said things she was sure of. Bess nodded. She slid off the fence rail and went back inside, Peck behind her, and the door banged shut, and Cora went back to her digging. The recipe box sat on the kitchen shelf now, between the salt crock and the window, where the light hit it in the morning. It was a small cedar box, plain, with a brass clasp, and it had belonged to her mother, and it had been in her satchel on the boardwalk in November. And it was here now. She had not put it away. She had set it on the shelf the first week, and it had stayed there. And sometimes Bess asked her about the cards inside, and Cora would take one out and read it to her, her mother's handwriting in brown ink on yellowed paper. And Bess would listen with the seriousness she brought to serious things. The cards were not going anywhere. Neither was Cora. Wren came in from the smithy at noon and washed at the pump and came into the kitchen and found lunch on the table and Cora at the stove. And he sat down and she sat across from him and they ate. And Ward came in from school early because the afternoon was free, and Bess came down from wherever she had been. And the four of them were at the table in the good spring light, and the door was open to let in the air, and Peck was asleep under the table, pretending not to be there. And Wren looked at Cora across the table with the look he had, the one that said what he did not say in words. And she looked back at him with her creekwater eyes, steady and warm, and the house held its warmth around them, not waiting for anyone, not any more. The cottonwoods were full out now, and the creek was running clear, and the kitchen garden was turned and waiting, and the porch step that had been loose since October was tight and solid underfoot, and the recipe box caught the morning light on its brass clasp, and the farm at the edge of Hatchet Creek was not called the lonely place anymore, not by anyone. And the silence where that name used to be was the best kind of silence there is. And that was the story of Cora Vass, a woman who arrived in Hatchet Creek with a satchel and a recipe box and nothing promised, and found, in a plain house on a creek road in the long, cold months between November and spring, the thing she had been patient enough to wait for without knowing she was waiting. Let me know in the comments if this one found you. Thank you.